So for our next painting project, we are going to be doing a study of Winslow Homer. He's not really a common name outside of the art world, but he's one of the first American big name painters, especially for landscapes. One thing that Winslow Homer did was he started working with watercolor, and previous to this, watercolor was more of a prep study or like a sketching kind of material. So he started making watercolors that were finished products, and so he's one of the people that actually kind of put watercolor on the map as an established medium in the art world. So I am on the Google Arts and Culture website. If you've never gone on that website, it's a fantastic resource. He started out as a lithographer, and he would actually do illustrations for magazines. A lot of his illustrations were actually from Civil War. So Homer would make illustrations that the magazines would use because we're right at the early stages of photography, and there's no documentation of the Civil War in action in photography. Photography is still at its infancy with the really long exposures. This website is really great because we can zoom in and you think that's all, but you can keep zooming in. What the Google Arts and Culture website did is they took high resolution photos of paintings and artworks from all around the globe so that you can zoom way in. So if you really want to look at a Van Gogh close up, then you can do that. We've maxed out. But what this does is we keep talking about layering in watercolor and the process of going from the light to the dark. So right here on this back wall is a perfect example. This kind of beige color, you can see it was done pretty much everywhere, because there's a little bit of that beige even behind these red vases on this table. And then you can see they did this beige. Then Homer put down this lighter gray, did the table, and then this darker gray is on top of that. So each successive layer is getting darker. These darker greens are 100% done afterwards because that dark value layers over these lighter grays. So as you're planning out your project, what you do need to do is figure out your process and figure out what steps, what's first, what's second, what's third, what's layered on top of each other. This kind of reddish color, it can layer over this, but you can see it can't layer over this. So when he did this gray, then some of these areas were avoided. Let's look at the lady a second and what she's wearing. Can you see how this really light beige, once again, there's a lot of that underneath. This light beige, you can see it's a little bit underneath the skin tone. It's the base of the shirt that she's wearing. So all of this could have been done with beige, except for the parts he kept white for highlight. And then this gray is put over it for the stripes. And then this kind of bluish, greenish color is layered over it. And then this darker blue is layered over it in the shadow. So if we look at the process, you can see the definite steps. You're going to have a list to choose from. If yours is on this, you can come in here, zoom way in, and be able to look at things close up. So even things like this jacket, it's a light brown and then there's a darker brown layered over it. Same with the hat. This is how we get our shapes and our shadows. You can see the tree trunk, there's that lay, and then there's darker and there's darker. So as we keep talking about making sure that there's not one area of flat, solid color, this tree is a great example of that. There's a lot of the same colors, but there's different concentrations of the watercolor. So you have dark and you have light. So there's movement and variety, even in something simple as that. A lot of layering going on. So you'll notice that a lot of these are folded. When we're in class, what we do is fold them to get our grid. We're going to talk about gridding in just a second. There are some lines where I figured out where the middle is. So if I measured this out and figured out the midpoint, I know where halfway is. On my drawing, there are midpoints to give me the same rough estimate. So I know that if I'm putting this figure in my drawing, it's got to be slightly off-centered, and about halfway is just below her waist. So as I'm drawing that out, I can slightly off-center. And that just helps being able to put, the chickens and the table in the back and all of that. So remember, watercolor is very much about planning. So you do need to take the time, get your proportions right, and do a good drawing. Very, very light sketch, not heavy, but you do need to take the time to get your proportions. So let's talk about how to grid. First of all, this and this might be the same proportions in terms of size. Obviously, this is smaller, but I need to figure out what's the same proportions so that I can make this bigger than this and use up as much of my paper as possible. So the easiest way to do it is think about if you're making a PowerPoint, if you're doing a presentation, anytime you're taking a file and you're making it bigger, you pull from the corner to keep it the same proportions so it doesn't get skewed. It's basically the same idea. If I am going to try and use as much of this paper as possible, if I line up my picture, my reference material, with the same edge, so this corner is 100% matched up. At that point, if I make a line from this corner through this corner, okay, so I'm matching up this corner and this corner, anything along this line is going to be the same proportions. So if I want to use up as much of my paper as possible, right there, I would just at that point draw a line all the way across, and then I know that that space is the same proportions, same ratio of length to width. I could stop anywhere along this, so if I only wanted to use up this much of the paper, I could go right here and draw a line here and straight down. That would be the same. But you always want to try and use up as much as your paper. Let's say you want to leave a little bit of an edge. Maybe I don't want to start my painting on the edge. I want a little bit of space. I can still do the same thing. Now instead of the corner, I just have to think of right here as where I'm starting my painting. Same thing. I'm going to go from this corner through this corner. I can, kind of eyeball it. So I could, at that point, draw in my proportions using that point and that point. So that's how to get the actual right size. So to keep it simple, I'm going to use as much of the page for how to grid. I'm going to draw in that edge. So now I know that this space, I can have the same proportions. So now let's talk about that grid. Right now, this paper, my reference material, it's been folded in half, and then it's been folded in half this way. When I'm transferring and doing my initial sketch, it's really helpful to know that this boat is gonna 100% be in the bottom half. The top half of my painting is this. This is the bottom half. I can do the same thing if I'm figuring out that most of the boat is gonna be on this side and only that part of the boat is on that half. So this half of the painting is a lot of just the landscape. So how does that translate in here? I measure and I find out where's my midpoint. I'm not going to draw the actual grid on here, but I can make little landmarks. So this is my halfway point. I can do the same thing with my height. So this is my midway point. So this is about the middle of my painting. I always like to double check it. So you can always go old school and just think, okay, from thumb to finger, that works. Okay, so I know this is my middle. So now when I start sketching, right smack in the middle of my painting is this guy's hat. It's just shy. So now when I start sketching that, really lightly, this guy's hat is going to be about here. You can keep going. If you look at this one has been folded in half, in quarters. You can get as much into your gridding system as you want to. One thing that also is helpful is don't forget about comparative measurements. If this man, from the top of his head to where he hits the boat, right here on my midline, how much of, let's say, the bottom? It's a little less than a third. So he's not half. What happens is a lot of times people end up making him, this big. So gridding out really helps plan so you can work on your sketch. So a quick review. We've been working with layers a lot, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. You can see previous videos if you need to review that. But let's say I was doing this painting by Winslow Homer, and I had to figure out how to layer this really, really light color of the hat. Can I put it underneath this reddish color? Probably, because this is kind of an orangey underlay. Can I put pure bright blue over that? Not as much. Okay, it might dull it. So what you have to do is think, if there's a really, really bright blue, I can't put a yellow underneath it or it's going to make it muddied and make it a little bit greenish. These down here, these are kind of greenish, khaki kind of colors, so maybe this color could go underneath it. So you have to figure out where you can make your life much, much easier by layering and utilizing the layering process. You can see in the background just how this lighter color is, and then this darker color is across it, but obviously you have to avoid it for the white of the sails. So if I was starting this painting, maybe I would start it like this. Down at the bottom, I have that kind of yellowy color. That blue and yellow kind of mixed to get that weird color of grayish blue. But I did not put the yellow down because I wanted the bright blue of the shirt. I didn't put it down underneath the bright blue of the water, because whatever colors you want to stay true and pure, you can't layer over it. And then you can see what the blue looks like layered over it. Think about where you can layer. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just have to avoid the areas and be real specific. But if you can layer and build up the colors in that way, now that I have that front part, now I can layer over a little bit of a lighter green and then more of that darker green underneath it. Try and identify where you can build up those layers. Don't do the coloring book approach. The problem with the coloring book approach, just remember, is that if I am avoiding doing layers, then I'm gonna have to watch out and not have white in between all my spots. So by doing this, I don't have those white in between areas. Right here, I have to make sure that the blue that I do for the shirt is gonna go all the way to my edges, so I have to be a little bit more specific.